And now that the recording's on, I will say officially welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, November 11th. My name is Heather Kraus. I am the founder of a project called We All Count, which is a project for equity in data. And we get together on not every Friday, but most Fridays to have an informal conversation about the practice of data equity, the tools and the successes and the struggles, and finding ways to share experiences and share resources so that anybody who is looking for a way to embed equity in the way that they're working with data can do that and feel less alone and feel connected and have a place to ask questions. So some Fridays we have topics, some Fridays we have special guests. This Friday we have a special guest. And our special guest is Aubrey Blanche, otherwise known as the Math Path. And several of you requested that we ask Aubrey to join us. And once I started checking out their materials, I could understand why. Fantastic person doing really important work. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on a formal bio. Of course, you can always look it up in the links to the Talking Data Equity materials that we'll share. But essentially, Aubrey does a lot of amazing work about redesigning and reimagining systems, practices, teams, corporations, research to ensure that it is in fact equitable. And their work stands for themselves, absolutely. And you can find a lot of that work at aubreyblanche.com. That is all the time I will take up of our very valuable hour. And I will turn it directly over to Aubrey and say, on behalf of the many people who requested that you join us for a Friday, thank you for finding time in your schedule. And it's great to see you today.
Thank you, Heather, so much. I'm so grateful. And I was just, for folks online, I was just telling Heather when she reached out, I was so excited because in DEI, I think there's so many like incredibly passionate advocates, but I am such a deep believer and a nerd in technical and data things that like, I feel like I've found my people a little bit. So I'm just really grateful to be here and to be able to share a little bit about the kinds of issues that I worked on. So I'll get started. Let me grab my slides. Okay, cool. Can people see that? Awesome. So really what I wanted to talk about today was to bring together this idea of equitable design. So we'll talk about what that is, but it's really, I think about my theory of change, of how we get to creating equity, because I believe in seeing things, whether that's products, organizations, et cetera, as dynamic systems. And I think that that gives us a lot of power to change them, right? Because it means that every aspect of what we're looking at is some kind of design decision that has an impact on the output of what we're talking about. And I am such a believer that data, and really thoughtfully both structured, connected, managed data, is the foundation not only of our ability to understand whether something is equitable in the current state, but also allows us to redesign those systems to produce more equitable outcomes over time. And for folks who don't know me, Heather is totally right. People call me the Math Path, which is a little bit of a moniker. It's like way less cool than Ziggy Stardust. But really what it was a couple of years ago, I was working with a creative team, and the challenge that I was trying to solve was I was trying to figure out a way to communicate this idea of combining a very rigorous mathematical based approach to equity with this grounding in the fundamental dignity and value of every person. And what some very awesome creative geniuses came up with was this idea of Math Path, which is a math nerd plus empath. And so what I always say, especially to data folks, is like, I hope you walk away from this feeling like you can be a math path, in that you can combine these two sort of different perspectives to create a more human approach to something that can feel a little bit clinical at times. And so then my sort of training initially was in mixed methods social science. So I spent a little bit of time at Stanford being trained as a political scientist. So I studied military strategy and terrorist organizational behavior, and then decided that was a little bit too sad. So I decided to study racism in tech. Because no one told me that was equally depressing. But so I really think about that as I come in with a social scientist toolbox to study these issues, and then marry that with a lot of deep study of sort of intersectional social justice theory, disability justice, queer theory, et cetera. So I have this very kind of funky background, but my hope is that that allows me to say something slightly different, or to bring together what are often seen as disparate fields. And I hope that's something that you're excited about, because you can do it too. Um, so when I talk to a lot of people, I always ask, like, who would say I care about diversity? And I'm rarely in a room where most people don't raise their hands, which is lucky for me. But what I always tell people is that care doesn't help anyone. And what I mean by that is lots of people talk about caring about diversity, but they haven't actually taken action to include someone, or to examine the power that they have within their sphere of influence to create change. And so I don't say that to shame anyone. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown, and I do not believe that shame leads to anything productive. I do think just a little bit of guilt can be motivating. But that's what I would say here, is that this idea of, like, if you haven't put that care into action yet, good news, there's still time. And that I think in this room, this is probably not the case, but I like to start in the same place. And so, what I hope we do by the end of this session is that each of you can move towards being able to say this, which is, I have an active practice of equitable design. And the reason I think this is really important is because equity is an ongoing process of creating fair outcomes that are cognizant of the historical and present day structural and interpersonal privileges and disadvantages that someone might have, right? So, just like Katie Heron in Mean Girls, we say the limit does not exist. Equity does not actually exist. I always say that equity is an asymptotic function, in that just because we can't quite get there doesn't mean it's not a useful project, and we can't pretend like we do for the mathematical simplicity and elegance of it. Also, I want to thank everyone in the room, because I don't often get to say asymptotic functions in my talks. So you are just making my day. But that's what, when I think about equity, it really comes down to this idea of, like, it is something we continuously move towards, and we can always keep perfecting. And I hope that that's a really hopeful message, in that there's always something you can do. And it can be very easy to get stuck in this idea that, like, oh, I can't get perfectly to equity, so I should do nothing. But the fact is, both that's a silly way to think about it, but also within social justice theory, harm reduction is a very legitimate ethic, right? So to say, well, I can't get rid of all anti-Black discrimination, so I'm going to do nothing, doesn't necessarily make sense. But saying, I can make it 10 to 20% less likely that someone is going to experience anti-Blackness as the result of you using my product or being in my organization. Like, that is still a valuable thing that fundamentally changes people's lives. And the first step towards being able to say that is actually being able to answer the question, what does the system look like now? And also to measure the system over time. So generating that longitudinal data to say, are we actually moving towards that asymptotic limit? So when I think about one of my favorite things about talking about data and equity is that we're talking about people. And one of the hardest things about data and equity is that we're talking about people. And so one of the challenging projects of what we're doing in this is that data is inherently in binaries or strict categories, and human beings do not actually exist that way. And so one of the topics that I geek out the most on, and Heather, maybe I will send you a blog on this to share with folks, but this idea of developing data ontologies for collecting data. And there's a few different things to think about when you collect ontologies. So I fundamentally believe that there is no one correct data ontology for collecting data on identity. And the reason is because the purpose and use of that data is incredibly important to know before you design the ontology. So a lot of the different factors that go into this, I think first about what is the purpose of the data and what are you trying to learn from it? Because that tells you what labels you should be putting on the data when you combine that with things like what's the end size of your data? So one of the most challenging data ontology questions I get in my work is around race and ethnicity ontologies. Because cross-nationally, right, the entire category construct is different for people, but also there are a myriad ways to collapse and deconstruct those categories. And so I get a lot of questions from my clients or even my employer Culture Amp, because we have one of the world's largest employee data sets. So our customers have tons of these questions, and they say, how should we do this? Should we be having questions that are white versus BIPOC? Should we break it out into, for the US-based folks, EEOC categories? But that's really weird because like Middle Eastern is lumped in with white, and Asian describes I think it's 43 different countries, but we've decided to push them all into one category called Asian, even though they have very different cultural and political histories. And the answer is there is no right answer. So for me, it comes down to a couple of factors. One, end size. So can you create groups that have meaningfully similar experiences, but also give you the interpretive power to respond to what the data is telling you? So in my smallest clients, I tell them, you know what, for now, white and BIPOC are what you should be using. Because even though we can all agree that Black and Asian folks and Latinx folks like myself have different life experiences, if we break them down in too small of categories, we actually don't get the end size that we need to both protect those individuals' privacy and get interpretive value from the data. Right. So that's what I think of as how do you get a category that allows you to respond to the data? And I think that response is so important because often I imagine if anyone here has corporate overlords, that people, think of collecting data itself as an exercise in equity. And I actually disagree. I think that what you do once you've collected data is what produces equity. And so you need to make sure that you can take some kind of meaningful action with it. That's both philosophically true, but also if you're not able to take thoughtful action from that data collection, you're likely breaking down trust with people, right? Because it's an inherently vulnerable thing to do to provide your individual identity data to any system, especially when we live in a world where systems of oppression exist everywhere. So, one more thing I wanted to say about this. The other question I often get about data equity is what labels do we put on it? And I see a lot of my customers making the classic mistake of choosing the labels that are the most socially progressive or philosophically justice oriented because they want to show that intention. And what I would say is that's not a terrible idea if the people providing the data resonate with those labels and understand what they mean. And so it's actually more important in terms of getting high quality data that you can action, that you choose labels that resonate with the people who are going to be interacting with the data collection apparatus that you're using. So a good example of this is if you were going into the broader community, especially communities that are less knowledge work or less likely to be educated, you might actually choose the label Hispanic rather than Latinx. Right? Or you might choose Latino instead of Latinx, because even those sort of more progressive parts of that community would identify with Latinx or non-binary folks in that community. The average person of Latin American descent doesn't actually deeply resonate with it. And so that's an example where we bring our sort of data knowledge in with this continuous education that we have to do about the cultural context in which we're collecting data, right? You could, or maybe you choose to do Hispanic or Latino / Latinx, right? There's lots of different ways. It's an art to craft those data labels, but the goal is to get the highest quality data. And that often means going with what your respondent is going to resonate with, not what you personally prefer. Right. Um, so, and all of this is complicated by a myriad of different issues. So I imagine that no one here thought we were going to be talking about Roman architecture in this talk. But what you're seeing on the screen is an aqueduct. So what an aqueduct was, for folks who aren't aware, is a structure that carried water into ancient Rome. And it allowed Rome to support a significantly larger population than they would have otherwise. But there was something that was highly problematic about them. And that's that the pipes were lined with lead. So bad news. And so I like to think about the systems that we're working in as really similar to aqueducts, in that they're largely marvels of human engineering, but that there is racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, transphobia, homophobia built into the pipes. And what we're doing with this project of collecting, using, managing data from an equity perspective is to get the lead out. And so the reason that data is so powerful in this work is because it actually allows us to replace the pipes thoughtfully without tearing down the whole structure. And that's what I do every day when I help companies with organizational and product transformation, is how do we use data to identify the sources or the gaps in equity and intentionally make investments to do that change. The reason this actually works, besides the fact that I'm telling you because I've been doing it for 10 years, is because it actually means that rather than throwing a bunch of money at a problem but not knowing where you're going, or what a lot of companies do or organizations do is throw spaghetti at the wall and hope that it creates fairness, you actually take a very intentional approach to investing in the things that matter for that specific organization or that specific product. Because the fact is, inequity in organizations and systems, Tolstoy got it right, which is every happy family is the same. Every inequitable system is inequitable in its own way, to butcher the beginning of Anna Karenina a little bit. So I think it's really important. We'll dive into the design principles in a minute, but the fact is, what is equitable is actually a really complicated question. And the fact is, there's no technical definition of what is equitable. And so that also complicates our work. In addition to figuring out what data we should collect, how we should manage it, store it, and delete it, is what are we actually looking for in the first place? And when I think about this, a lot of people confuse the idea of equity and equality, but they're really intrinsically related. And so what I say, especially in large N, is that the presence of equality in data suggests equity of process. So we have some underlying assumptions that make that true. One, phrase that I've seen so much on LinkedIn that it's almost a cliche at this point, but they say opportunity or talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And so when I see equality in large N data, what that tells me is that the system itself has generated equal opportunity, because in expectation, I have equality of outcome proportional to the people that we're talking about. So in a talent system, if in the US, 13% of people are Black, I would expect 13% of applicants to be Black, 13% of job offers to go to Black people, 13% of promotions in my organization, right, to go to Black people, because that would indicate to me that we have created equality of opportunity within that system, even when we know that equality of opportunity does not exist outside that system. So again, to me, equality in expectation gives me insight about the equity of a process. It would be the same thing if you were working in a product, right? That's about user applications, sign-up flows, attrition of users. You can use those same proportions. So equitable proportions equal across every part of a process. And when I think about like what is equitable, the operationalizing question that I use is like, does this thing that I'm doing, does this thing that I'm gathering, or does this process or systemic tweak that I'm making help create equal power or equal opportunity? And if I don't know the answer to this question, because it requires both sort of the liberal arts knowledge as well as the technical knowledge, that tells me an area where I have learning and development to do. Because I believe that in order to make more equitable decisions, we have to constantly engage in a process of learning, right? And constantly educating ourselves. We're not expected to be perfect. We're not expected to know everything, but leaning on the resources that we have. The Google machine is amazing for this, because there are so many people who have shared their insights. Before this last week, when it became a Nazi hell site, I would have also suggested Twitter. For this, I have learned more about the lived experiences of people dissimilar to me on Twitter than basically anywhere else on the internet, because it can be such a vulnerable place. So I would say now use with caution. I'm not quite sure where that resource is going. Um, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what I use in all of my work. So we talk about this process of equitable design, and it turns out that there are design principles that you can use that can help answer all of the questions that you need to design equitably. And not only can you use these to have a more equitable data management process or practice, but these are the exact same principles that I use to design equity creating programs and organizational transformation strategies. So the idea is that these principles can be applied to really any situation to help you make more equitable decisions and help get to more equitable outcomes. So the first is consent. And this is one that I think a lot of people that work with data, especially around sensitive or marginalized populations, are really familiar with. And in the medical field, we talk about this idea of informed consent. And I believe that's incredibly important when we're talking about data equity. So I fundamentally believe that we own and have a right to the data about ourselves that we provide in any situation. And if you're familiar with GDPR, Europe does a great job of codifying this into law. So GDPR is that general data protection regulation that is operating in the EU, but really sets the privacy and consent standards for data around the world. And so people who are giving you data should have fully informed consent about what data they're providing, how it will be used and managed, and how it will be accessed. That means you probably need a data management policy that you're welcome to share with people. Not everybody's going to read it, but we should do the legwork to make sure that people can give that fully informed consent if they are going to go looking for it. Next, marginality. So when we talk about marginality, this is really a design principle. We talk about designing for the stress case or the edge case. So designing for the most marginalized user. In many cases where I see this come up, for example, is in collecting data on LGBTQ people. And in the US today, I would say trans people are an example, where we need to think about not just what's the ontology of the data we're collecting, but is it safe for us to collect this data based on the real world harm that could come to someone who might provide it? So when I was at Atlassian, for example, we declined to collect LGBTQ data on our staff in many countries because homosexuality was still considered a crime. And so we felt that even though we'd love to improve that employee experience, the trade-off of potentially putting those employees in harm's way was not worth it. And that was, we thought about the most marginalized users when we considered whether it was data that should be collected or used. The third principle is community. And this one's pretty simple. When you're collecting data on marginalized groups, which is really what we tend to focus on in equity, we need to make sure that we're collecting data with and for that community. And so it can be really easy to get into places where we're doing like performative diversity or performative equity work. Where I tend to see this a lot, and it's not without good intention, is in big philanthropy. So I sit on the board of a couple nonprofits. I consult with nonprofit organizations, and often large foundations will ask questions of nonprofits like, what is the demographic makeup of your staff? What is the demographics of the people that you're serving? And while that might be coming from the intention of wanting to make sure that there's equity in terms of the operations and impact of that organization, it's not always considering whether it's appropriate to collect that data from those people or whether it feels safe to collect that data from those people, right? So sometimes, even if the intention is good, collecting data for the purpose of appeasing the white people who feel bad about the historical white supremacy of philanthropy maybe isn't the reason that's serving those marginalized users. And so again, really thinking about with the community first and for the community second. The last is progress or progression. So I really, really want to drill in this idea that improving just a little bit is worthwhile, right? So again, because we talk about equity as an asymptotic function, you can't get there, but steps toward that are important and are worthy of doing. And I think sometimes when we're talking about social justice, we let perfect be the enemy of better. And so it can be easy to also get hopeless. So that's what I would say is like every step forward that you can take, maybe it's being more thoughtful about your deletion privileges. Maybe it's updating your labels to be more relevant to the users, right? There's little things that we can do that move us towards the most equitable of data practices, especially when we're dealing with stakeholders who might have lower levels of expertise than what folks on the line have. So Heather can share this deck afterwards. So I'm going to go through this last part pretty quickly so we can leave time for questions. But I really like to teach Socratically and really think in questions. So each of these principles for me has a set of questions associated with them that help me design more equitably. And I thought it would be helpful to go through a few of them to see how we apply the principles in practice. So thinking about consent. Questions that I think about with my clients and customers is, how was consent achieved? Did we communicate in multiple formats, say a video and written, to make sure it's accessible to people with different learning and comprehension styles? Was it fully informed, and what does that mean? Does the way I communicated about the purpose of data collection cover both how it is stored, handled, what control they have over it, and when, if, and how it will be deleted, right? And what control do users functionally have over their data, and are they aware both that they have this control and how they can access that control? Marginality. So here, thinking about how is data sampled? Are we actually getting representative data from the most marginalized people within a particular potential data set? Is it representative for some reason? So in some ways, we need to be careful about representative because our data can actually create inequity if it is representative. One of my favorite examples of this is a book by Safiya Noble called Algorithms of Oppression, right? I imagine a lot of folks on the line are familiar with her work, but this idea that like racial biases are built into search algorithms. And so representative data is inherently inequitable in experience to people. And so it's not just asking that question helps us say, is this representative in a good way or a harmful way? And how do we deal with that? Even though we can't perfectly statistically correct for biased data sets, it doesn't mean, again, that we can't make those progressive improvements. Does the data reflect marginalized voices? What social biases are embedded in this data? Again, that requires making artful judgments, combining that social justice theory, liberal arts, sort of social scientific knowledge that we have with the understandings of the way to translate that into a data structure or a process of that data. Last, community. So who provided the data to us, right? Is this second degree knowledge, or is it coming from the actual subjects of the data themselves? What biases or limitations might the data providers have, either about people for whom they do not share the identity, or the biases that exist from the respondents, the users themselves? And then being really thoughtful, especially for marginalized communities. What is the end size of the data we're working with? And what are the potentials and limitations of the inferences that we can make from that data, given both who's providing it, where it's coming from, and how much of it we actually have? Knowing that larger N, more statistically valid inferences, but often even small N data can provide directional information that's valid. I always remind folks that sort of white supremacy culture that we live in that can be very quantitative often devalues small n or n equals 1 data. And I think we have to have a respect both for large as well as small n data because it tells us different types of stories that get us towards more equitable outcomes. And then progression. So first, what are the inferences or derivatives that are being made from the raw data that we have? Do we feel confident that we can make those? And what are the potential upsides and downsides of making those inferences? Progression, how is the data modified or deleted over time? Going back to, we want to communicate that with consent. And then also, how are we updating our understanding of those responses and updating our own understanding of the social context such that we can make more equitable decisions over time with the data that we're using? So again, these questions are things that can animate your work. And I would say there's no perfect answers, which gets back to this philosophy that I really believe in, which is if you're adjusting your practices by 1% every time you're able, you will get to huge changes. So a book that I really love is called Atomic Habits. And they talk about a 1% change every day over the course of a year actually leads to 300% growth. And so understanding that in the same way that asymptotic function moves, 1% can actually lead to exponential change. So my question to you all, because I imagine you are all already data experts, is how am I furthering my learning so that I have the knowledge to make the more equitable decisions that are already in line with the intentions that I carry in? So I know this is a lot. I'm glad there's a recording so you can go back, but I'm really, really excited to talk about all of your questions and answer them, I guess, to the best that I can. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. Those, you can see in the chat that there's already lots of questions and
Awesome.
lots of appreciation. You can see there's lots of hands clapping and little fireworks and little Zoom emoticons. So yeah, this has been just as valuable as anticipated. So thank you for being here. And then for the folks who are new, and folks who are here lots of Fridays, the way this works now, because we're really trying to continue to hold Talking Data Equity as a Zoom meeting, even though there's lots of people here, is that if you're in the room and you want to unmute and ask a question, we would love that. We would like it if you would either raise your hand, like in Zoom world, raise your hand, which means push on the little raise your hand button, which can sometimes be found on the by the picture of the little smiley face with a plus sign on its head. Or if you can't find the raise your hand sign, just put in the chat that you'd like to raise your hand and we'll unmute you in as close to the order as possible. And if you don't wish to ask your question out loud, you can put your question into the chat. And again, there are two ways to use the chat. You can either chat to everybody in the meeting and then everybody will see your question or your comment, or you can put in a chat that's only to me. My name is Heather Kraus, and I will ask your question without you having to attach your name to it. So does anybody in the room want to ask a question? And if not, we'll go to the chat questions. All right. So we'll start with a chat question while people decide if they want to raise their hands. There are many questions that have been direct messaged to me, and I'm gonna try and choose the ones that kind of a lot of people asked, so that for sure, one of the really common ones is, can you say that again, what you're talking about representative data and equity?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good question, and it's a little bit of a subtle concept. So this idea that data that is representative of actual humanity can be productive of inequity. So the example that I used, and thank you to the folks who have dropped it in the chat, that Algorithms of Oppression by Safia Noble talks about this. But so, for example, one of the reasons that a lot of AI systems are really trash from a bias perspective is because they were trained on real world data. And the fact is, the real world is inequitable. So data that is representative of, say, attitudes about Black women is going to produce discrimination, bias, and inequity for Black women because the world does that. So it's a really complicated problem. And one of like the not pieces of good news I have is there's been a good amount of work to look at ways that you can provide statistical correction to large N data sets. And the fact is you can't actually perfectly statistically correct for this. And so like in the example of an AI system, when I've worked with clients on this, what I say is that if you're training your models on a real world data set, in addition to your primary algorithm, you also need a monitoring algorithm. And what I mean by that is that you need to write an algorithm that's basically a test or a check that is producing an output that tells you whether the output of your primary algorithm is producing inequitable outcomes. So to get really technical, what you would do is you would basically set a statistical parameter of tolerance for difference in outcomes between groups. And then you would basically flag the system where if you say the results for different groups diverge by a certain statistical amount with a certain amount of confidence, then we need to go back and make changes to the primary algorithm to avoid that. So there are ways to deal with the inequities that exist in that data, but it basically is something that you can never turn off. You have to have continuous monitoring of outcomes from those systems, because otherwise you just end up replicating the bullshit that you found. So I hope that's helpful.
I think that will clarify for a lot of people who weren't quite sure. Now I think that that question has largely definitely been answered, is that if it's a representative data set, it will maybe give you a good idea of what's happening, but what's happening is very often not equitable. And so if you use that as a parameter, you will be reproducing that lack of equity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. There's a long question in the chat that we will go into now, because it is a question. The question that's in the chat where everybody can see it is also repeated many times in the private chats to me. I feel like there's a conflict in one of the things that you said. And of course, anytime we're dealing with equity, there is no one size fits all. This is going to work for everybody. So there will always be tensions and conflicts. You said in some cases to use the label Latino over Latinx because you want to design for the average person to get the most people to identify with the label. In the marginality principle, you said that to design for the most marginalized user. I worry that using the label of Latino isn't a matter of language preference, but exclusion and erasure of non-binary people in their racial identity. This is a complicated question, which we love. Thank you for asking a complicated question. But hopefully it'll be helpful to dig deeper into the specific example. We're also dealing with that repeatedly in the chat about things like sexual orientation and gender identity, because a lot of us are struggling with this exact question of if we ask what feels like a very inclusive gender identity question, let's say, what we're often experiencing is a lot of other people don't have any idea how to answer that question, not necessarily because they don't believe in gender fluidity and gender non-binary, but they're not educated in the categories and look at the categories and have no idea what to do. So it is a conflict. Like there isn't going to be a perfect answer. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So like bonus points for Erin. I love that question. And so I think I would give a little bit of an artful answer, is that I think resolving that conflict in some ways requires getting a little bit creative with the data. So I'll just tell you what I would do in that situation. Let's say I was doing some political survey of Latinx or like Hispanic voter preferences, let's say, as an idea. I would actually decide to use two different questions to make sure that I wasn't erasing the experience of non-binary Latinx people, but I also was using ethnic terminology that resonated with the majority. Now, one thing to note about this particular thing is that there's a very large generational skew to who prefers what language. And so what I might actually do is I would use a category that said something like Hispanic or Latino, because that's going to cover upwards of 80% of the language preferences of the people in that group. So I'm more likely to get a higher N size of that. But I would couple that with a gender question that included the option for non-binary. And what that allows me to do is like in a cross tab, able to isolate the experience of non-binary folks of a Latinx heritage to be able to understand them in the data set. So I think it's a really good question. And the fact is, that's not a perfect answer. And I don't want to be like, that's what you would have to do. That's what I would likely do for that use case. And to kind of link that over to the other question that Heather put in, which I think is a really good one. So first of all, like the whole alphabet mafia problem is really difficult data-wise, because you're dealing with like gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation, which are like meaningfully different constructs that all get shoved together because they're not like cis dudes. And so one of the things is it depends on the data end size, but I think where possible, it's great to disaggregate that data if you can guarantee safety for the data providers. So at CultureAmp, for example, as a general rule, we don't suggest disaggregating those. We actually suggest that our customers do LGBTQ, yes, no, and then a separate question for transgender, yes, no, because what we found in our research was that like companies weren't likely to like have different programming for like gay versus bisexual employees. And so it didn't make sense for the collect data at that level of granularity. I think for something like there's a really fantastic trans survey that's out right now. So if you know any trans people, I will see if I can find it and follow up with Heather, get them to take it. It's the largest national survey of trans experience that exists. So like in the workplace context, I wouldn't disaggregate gender and sexual orientation that much because you're not likely to have separate programming. Now, I do think you're going to have separate programming benefits support for trans individuals. And so asking a separate question is valuable. Now, for example, in the application of that trans survey, having a highly expansive number of gender options is actually really important, right? Because you're trying to understand the nuance between subtle differences in experience. And you also likely have the N size in that specific population that you can make meaningful inferences, and hopefully folks will take meaningful action off the base of that data. So I think that goes back to this core principle that like there is no perfect ontology. You have to really think about the safety of the data providers and what the purpose of that data is and the potential usage of that data to understand where. But I bias towards as little granularity as possible because I'm a big believer in protecting privacy as much as possible. But again, I think when there's potential positive outcome for the community, so this trans survey is an example, that greater granularity can be justified because of the potential benefit to the data providers. So really, really good questions. And like I said, great minds could very much disagree with me on this because it is really a matter of opinion and how much you're weighting things like risk versus benefit.
Great conversation. And really, really important complexity. So ask the complex questions. That's fantastic. Yeah. I don't know the person's name off the top of my head, but a few months back, we had one of the people working on that trans survey at a Talking Data Equity. So if you look back through the old recordings, you will find that if you want to learn more about that survey. And I'm actually just going to share in the chat one of the tools that we use to help non-technical communities have exactly these kind of conversations about, for this project, should we use this particular set of categories or labels, or for that project, should we use this particular set of catalogs or labels? Awesome. And so another question, because we still have time, which is fantastic. A couple of people are really interested in what your thoughts are about consent, and people are wanting to get better at consent. And one of the things that they say is we are collecting local health data, and we are trying to redesign the way we do consent in order to make sure that people understand not only what we're doing with the data, but what questions we're answering and what purpose for the data. One of our struggles is that if we want to update people as we go along, in what's happening to their data. That means we have to collect more personal identifying data, like contact information. Have you struggled with that? I hadn't thought of that. That's a really, really good question. So the kind of balance between consent and then collecting like emails or addresses or something like that. Have you had experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good question and gets into this idea. So this is going to be a very meta response, but I try to give people consent at the level of individuation or identification that they're providing with the data. And what I mean by that is I think health is a really great example where you're collecting the data for one purpose, but over time you actually may desire to use the data outside the scope which you originally communicated, and you need to get additional consent for that. And so what I would say is you have to be really careful about sort of the way you do data tagging so that you can differentiate data that, but what I would say is that you should be very explicit with people about like, it is possible that we may desire to use this data for other purposes. We will not do that without your explicit consent. If you consent to be contacted for those types of purposes, please include your email here, but making that question optional. So people who maybe are willing to say, I'm happy to tell you about the cancer history in my family so that you can match that up with incidence data in the community, have the option to give you their anonymized health data or their individuated health data. So when I think about consent, it's just trying to be as explicit as possible with people about why you're collecting data that's highly individualized or is PII, like an email address when combined with health data. But I also say, can you provide, like, I think an email address is the perfect data collect. It's not something like a social security number if you can avoid it, because there's a much higher risk for someone in providing something like an SSN compared to an email. So I think it's a matter of being explicit, also making sure that any data that would create kind of a PII individuation issue should be optional, because I think then you can up your data quality. The downside of that, just to be really transparent, would be that you're going to need to be able to segment your data set so that only the people who provided email addresses would you be able to get additional scope of consent for additional uses and inferences of that data. It's a downside, but I think it's worth it from an integrity perspective and respecting the privacy of your data providers.
Yeah, there's always pros and cons. So that is fabulous. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. We're going to try and wrap it up in about 4 minutes so that people who have back-to-back meetings and have to go at 1, have to be somewhere at 1, have 5 minutes to not look at a screen. I think I'm trying to find the most upvoted question. And I think it is, if we agree, this is from several different people who work for governments, so federal governments or local governments, and it'll be, they didn't specify a country, but I believe it's the United States. So when we are required to collect and report data in order to provide access to federal services to our communities, and we aren't comfortable with the level of transparency around ownership and the level of transparency around marginality, do you have any practical suggestions about how to take that 1% step that is something other than quitting my job?
Oh, that is such a good question. So I want to couch anything that I say in that, like, this is not my experience. And so I don't necessarily want to speak with too much authority on it. I don't ever think it's a good idea for me to make ethical recommendations for people that I've never been put in that ethical situation. I think it goes back to trying to implement ways that you're giving the users more control and consent. So a 1% improvement for me would be make it easy for a respondent to delete their data or get their data deleted later. If when they gave that consent, it wasn't fully informed, are you able to do a follow-up to tell people, here's how your data is being used. Are you still comfortable with that? And I think those are meaningful steps because they adhere to those principles of consent and really, that idea of privacy and control over data. But I also understand that there are like legal compliance issues where you're being compelled to do something that may not feel great. Something I do, this is not necessarily a recommendation, but maybe it makes you feel better, is I work in workplaces, right? And one of the weird things about like workplace demographic data is that for your EEO1 report, you are not allowed to require demographic data from any of your employees, but you are not allowed to have missing data in your EEO1 report. And so what I do, like what some companies do, is this really creepy ass thing where they like look at your employee photo and like guess and fill it out for you. And I think I have a bias against that as like a woman of color who's white assumed. I'm like, oh, y'all will guess wrong. And I find that really offensive. But I assume that every person who has missing data is a white man, even if I'm vaguely sure it's not. And the reason I do that is because that means that my clients or, you know, my employer is never overestimating the amount of progress that they've made on racial equity. Right. So like the most conservative or like the worst case example is they're like, oh, we suck more than we want to, we'll invest more in these processes. But it also means that I'm not telling someone, making like weird assumptions about what their identity are. And we actually tell people that in our data collection policy. So we say, if you choose not to provide data, that's completely fine. For our purposes of analysis, we will assume that you're a cisgender white man who is non-disabled, who is not a caregiver, who speaks English as a first language. And so again, people can say like, oh, I don't like that. Great, you can provide your data, but know that we are making a blanket assumption about all employees as opposed to trying to make an individual assumption about you. And again, not a perfect thing, but that's like an example of where I believe the worst case scenario of that is better than the worst case scenario of like weird, creepy individual level assumptions.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. I hadn't heard of that idea. And like, absolutely, as you say, it's not a perfect solution. It's not going to be a good solution for some situations, but it's a very interesting solution for other situations. So thank you for providing it, because I don't think we've heard that before in Talking Data Equity. So that's we haven't heard a lot of the things you've said today before.
I was going to say, I don't know if like what the takeaway today is, like lie on your EEO1 report.
Oh, we're not expecting you to summarize any kind of a single takeaway. That's not how we roll here. No worries. But what I will say is we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for coming. I know that there are still questions that are outstanding. If you want to put those questions into the Data Equity Forum, we will answer them for sure. And there's also a request for some resources in the chat, and we'll be put up the video for this. We will also link to a bunch of resources. There was also a request for some books on data ontologies and things like that. And we definitely have some favorite ones. We'll put those up. And if you have favorite ones, put them up. And we are back next Friday. We have Jamel Watson Daniels coming next Friday, which is also very exciting. Talking
I think Heather got disconnected. Well, I'll wrap it up. One thing I'll say is that I already sent Heather over the slides, and so she'll be able to share those in the forum or via email with folks. That's totally fine. Oh, Heather, you're back.
Don't know what is happening. It's pouring rain in Toronto, so could just be internet. So I'm back. Thank you so much for coming, Aubrey, and thank you so much for coming, everyone else, and devoting an hour of your very valuable Friday to Talking Data Equity. We will put up the recording and all the links to resources as soon as possible. And if you're interested, we will see you next Friday. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.